Hey guys, tonight we begin with a queen, a woman so clever, ruthless and dangerously charming that her love life still gives historians anxiety. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Cleopatra VII didn't just inherit a throne, she inherited a family tragedy with better lighting. The Ptolemies, her ancestors, had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, and every single one of them seemed allergic to sanity. They were Greek royals pretending to be Egyptian gods, which was fine until they started taking it literally. Their favourite hobby? Marrying each other. The Ptolemies were so obsessed with keeping the bloodline pure that their family tree looked less like a tree and more like a pretzel. Generations of sibling marriages produced rulers with the emotional stability of wet papyrus. Cleopatra was one of the rare exceptions, intelligent, multilingual, and only slightly traumatized by her relatives. She grew up in Alexandria, the Las Vegas of the ancient world, beautiful, loud, and constantly one bad decision away from chaos. The palace was filled with golden statues, marble corridors, and enough gossip to fuel an entire Netflix series. Outside, the great library held the combined knowledge of the known world. Inside, her family couldn't remember which Ptolemy was currently king. Her father, Ptolemy XII, nicknamed Orleats, the flute player, wasn't famous for wisdom or leadership, mostly for bribing Roman senators and playing the flute while the empire crumbled around him. Historians call it diplomacy. Realistically, it was just vibing through political collapse. Cleopatra watched as he threw Egypt's wealth at Rome to keep his throne, learning an important royal lesson. When you can't rule well, pay someone scarier not to notice. At home, survival was a full-time job. Her siblings plotted, courtiers schemed, and poison was practically a condiment. Cleopatra learned early how to smile convincingly while mentally calculating who might try to stab her next. By 14, she could flatter a priest, quote Aristotle, and tell when a wine cup wasn't safe to drink, all essential skills for a dynasty that considered murder a form of networking. The Ptolemaic family motto might as well have been, "It's only treason if you fail." And in that madness, Cleopatra thrived. While everyone else was busy inheriting paranoia, she inherited timing. The dynasty was rotting from the inside out, but Cleopatra already understood the truth. If your kingdom is burning, make sure the flames are flattering. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, was the kind of man who made you question hereditary monarchy. His nickname, Orleats, the flute player, says it all. While other kings led armies or built monuments, he played music and begged Rome for financial aid. Imagine a man ruling an empire like he's trying to host a dinner party during a hurricane. That was Orleats. Egypt under his reign was, let's call it, financially creative. He spent lavishly on Roman bribes to keep his crown, which worked right up until he couldn't afford more bribes. The treasury emptied, taxes skyrocketed, and the people rioted. Shocking, really, how little patience starving peasants have for imported harps. Cleopatra, however, was paying attention. She watched her father stumble through politics like a man wearing sandals on wet marble. He exiled rivals, trusted traitors, and tried to charm senators with music, not metaphorically. He literally played the flute for them. Cleopatra probably learned her first important lesson from him. Never mix performance art with foreign policy. But beneath the disaster, Orleats left his daughter one useful legacy: survival instinct. He was terrible at ruling but excellent at not dying, which in the Ptolemaic household was an accomplishment. He fled Egypt when the people revolted, hid in Rome, and somehow managed to buy his way back to power. Cleopatra observed all this like a scientist studying a bad experiment. She learned that leadership wasn't about justice or morality. It was about knowing when to bow, when to smile, and when to pretend to be impressed by Rome's ego. The Romans, for their part, treated Ptolemy like a cash machine that occasionally sang. They didn't respect him, they rented him. Cleopatra took note of that too. By the time she was 15, she'd figured out that Egypt's independence hung by a single thread, and that thread was tied to Rome's greed. When Auletes died, he left behind a nearly bankrupt kingdom, a fragile throne, and several children who hated each other. A solid foundation for any Greek family. Cleopatra mourned publicly, of course, but privately. She probably felt relief. Because finally, it was her turn to play. And unlike her father, she didn't bring a flute to a knife fight. When Cleopatra's father finally died, Egypt let out a collective sigh of relief, followed immediately by another riot. His will, in all its wisdom, left the throne to Cleopatra and her little brother Ptolemy XIII, who was about 10 years old and still thought political negotiation meant crying louder. To make it official, they were also married. Because the Ptolemies loved two things above all else: power and deeply uncomfortable family dynamics. At first, Cleopatra probably thought she could handle him. She'd been trained in languages, mathematics, and diplomacy, while he was still learning to spell his own name without assistance. But, as usual, the adults ruined everything. Her brother's advisors, especially a man named Pothinus, the ancient world's answer to a corrupt campaign manager, decided Egypt didn't need one queen. It needed one puppet. Preferably the smaller, male, more manipulable one. Cleopatra, being allergic to manipulation, disagreed, and thus began the royal sibling rivalry that made every Thanksgiving dinner afterward look tame. Propaganda flooded Alexandria. Murals, coins, and decrees started showing Ptolemy's face, slightly larger than Cleopatra's. Ancient Photoshop, basically. Cleopatra responded the only way possible, by disappearing. Well, exiled, technically. She was pushed out of the palace, stripped of power, and sent packing into the desert. Her little brother got the throne, his advisors got control, and Cleopatra got a sunburn and a grudge. But exile had its perks. Away from court, she gathered loyal troops, allies, and the kind of spite that fuels revolutions. The Ptolemaic civil war was brewing, half tragedy, half comedy, all family dysfunction. She wasn't just plotting her comeback, she was rehearsing it. Meanwhile, Egypt's capital turned into a political circus. Her brother's side claimed divine right, hers claimed competence, a rare luxury in Egyptian politics. Cleopatra knew she couldn't rely on numbers alone. She needed a symbol, a saviour, someone powerful enough to tip the scales, preferably one with legions, influence, and maybe a weakness for ambitious women. And wouldn't you know it, just as things reached their breaking point, a Roman general sailed into Alexandria chasing another war. His name was Julius Caesar, and Cleopatra had just found her new favourite game piece. Cleopatra didn't do exile quietly. She wasn't the type to sit in a tent crying over lost thrones. She was the type to plan a comeback with the same calm focus as someone picking which poison to use at dinner. The year was 49 BCE and Cleopatra was 21, ambitious, brilliant, and furious. Her little brother, Ptolemy XIII, sat on the throne surrounded by men who thought governing meant hoarding gold and whispering conspiracy theories. Alexandria buzzed with gossip about the exiled queen in the desert, and somewhere between the sand and the silence, Cleopatra started recruiting. She gathered mercenaries, allies, and enough attitude to power a small kingdom. She still had loyal generals, men who remembered her intelligence, her authority, and the fact that she paid better than her brother's bureaucrats. Every night by the fire, Cleopatra plotted not just her return, but her rebranding. She wouldn't crawl back. She'd arrive back, larger than life, with the kind of entrance people would tell stories about for centuries. And then fate, or just historically convenient timing, intervened. Julius Caesar, fresh from Rome's civil war, sailed into Alexandria in pursuit of his rival Pompey, who had fled there seeking sanctuary. Unfortunately, Sanctuary in Egypt came with a strict no refunds policy. Ptolemy's men had already chopped off Pompey's head and presented it to Caesar like a party favour. Caesar, being Caesar, was disgusted, but also intrigued. Egypt was unstable, rich, and politically available. Cleopatra saw the opportunity instantly. She knew Rome didn't back weakness, it backed spectacle. If she could win over Caesar, the most powerful man in the known world, her throne was hers again. The problem? She was technically a fugitive in her own kingdom, surrounded by soldiers who'd rather kill her than let her near the palace. The solution was creative. According to legend, Cleopatra had herself smuggled into Caesar's quarters rolled up inside a carpet. When the rug unfurled, there she was, unarmed, uninvited, and absolutely unforgettable. In that single act, she went from exiled queen to political prodigy. Her brother had men, armies, and titles, but Cleopatra had something better: timing, theatrical instinct, and a Roman general who couldn't look away. Julius Caesar was not the kind of man who got surprised easily. He'd conquered Gaul, survived mutiny, crossed the Rubicon, and overthrown a republic, all before lunch. But when a rolled-up carpet landed at his feet and Cleopatra uncoiled from it like a living metaphor for trouble, even Caesar had to pause and think, what in Jupiter's name just happened? There she was, 21, radiant, and perfectly aware of how shocking she looked standing in his chambers after weeks of civil war grime. Cleopatra didn't need soldiers. She had presentation. She spoke to him not as a beggar or a lover, but as an equal. And for a man who thought he'd already met every kind of genius and fool the world could offer, she was something new, a genius with eyeliner. Caesar listened to her pitch. Egypt in chaos, the throne unjustly stolen, the queen wronged but willing to make a deal. She offered stability, alliance, and Egypt's loyalty to Rome. What she didn't say, but both of them knew, was that she was also offering herself, not as a mistress, but as a political partner who understood Rome's hunger better than most Romans did. Within days, they were inseparable. Caesar moved into the royal palace, officially as a mediator, unofficially as Cleopatra's favourite Roman export. Her brother's camp panicked. Alexandria became a pressure cooker of gossip, armed guards, and misplaced torches. By the time Ptolemy's forces attacked the palace, Caesar and Cleopatra were already plotting a counterstrike between dinner courses. Their alliance wasn't romantic fluff. It was business wrapped in chemistry. Cleopatra gave Caesar a reason to stay in Egypt, and Caesar gave Cleopatra back her crown. Together, they crushed her brother's army along the Nile. Ptolemy, proving he was truly his father's son, tried to flee and promptly drowned, which is ancient history's way of saying, problem solved. When the dust settled, Cleopatra stood victorious beside the greatest general in the world. Egypt had a ruler again, Rome had a friend, and Caesar had the most complicated vacation of his life. For Cleopatra, this wasn't love. It was empire maintenance, and she'd just secured a renewal plan with benefits. Cleopatra didn't fall for Caesar. She recruited him. Their romance was less candlelit dinners and more high-stakes political theatre with suspiciously good lighting. She understood him instantly, an ambitious Roman with godlike self-esteem, the kind of man who could look in a mirror and see destiny staring back. Cleopatra didn't need to flatter him. She needed to reflect him. And she did, brilliantly. When Caesar looked at her, he saw a version of himself in eyeliner, intelligent, audacious, and allergic to mediocrity. She knew how to listen just long enough to make him feel wise, and how to challenge him just enough to make him obsessed. Egypt had gold, grain, and beauty, but Cleopatra was the export he didn't see coming. Their partnership was mutually beneficial, if not mutually honest. Caesar helped her reclaim her throne officially. She helped him pretend he wasn't looting Egypt unofficially. Together, they staged a new Egyptian monarchy, Cleopatra as the divine queen, Caesar as the civilized conqueror. It was a perfect PR arrangement. He left with trophies and bragging rights. She stayed with power and a baby. Yes, Caesarion, Little Caesar, was born soon after. The world's first royal rebrand in the form of a child. Cleopatra claimed he was Caesar's son. Rome collectively rolled its eyes and muttered, "Sure, Jan." But it didn't matter. In Egypt, perception was power, and Cleopatra's people saw her not just as queen, but as goddess and mother, a living Isis. While Caesar returned to Rome to patch up his republic, spoiler, he failed, Cleopatra ruled Egypt like she'd never left. She cut taxes, opened trade routes, and personally oversaw the Nile's administration, proving she wasn't just beautiful, she was annoyingly competent. And that, more than her looks, terrified Rome. Because Cleopatra didn't just charm Caesar, she outperformed him. She took the same ambition that built empires and made it look elegant. But Rome was watching. Senators whispered, poets gossiped, and the same men who toasted Caesar's victories began to ask uncomfortable questions about the queen who smiled too wisely. And Cleopatra, ever the strategist, knew it. Power attracts envy the way honey attracts flies. The only difference? Cleopatra never swatted. She waited for them to drown. Cleopatra didn't just rule Egypt, she marketed it. She understood something most rulers and nearly all modern politicians still don't. Perception is currency. If people believe you're divine, they'll forgive you for taxes, invasions, and the occasional murdered sibling. So Cleopatra went full brand management. She presented herself not just as a queen, but as Isis reborn, the mother goddess of Egypt. Her portraits shifted. Gone was the Greek royal aesthetic of past Ptolemies. In came Egyptian crowns, golden robes, and a public persona that said, "Yes, I'm mortal, but only on my less photogenic days." She spoke Egyptian fluently, the first ruler in her dynasty to bother learning it. The people adored her for it. Her Greek ancestors had treated the local language like a contagious disease. Cleopatra used it like a weapon. When she addressed the crowds, she didn't need translators, just charisma and eyeliner sharp enough to puncture egos. Inside her palace, every surface gleamed. Statues of gods, marble floors, scented lamps. Egypt was broke, but her image was priceless. She turned her palace into a stage, her life into theatre, and her rule into myth. Cleopatra wasn't just playing politics, she was curating legend. Of course, Rome didn't buy it. To them, she was an exotic distraction wrapped in perfume and deceit. But Rome's disdain only made her myth stronger, because while senators in togas mocked her Eastern excess, half their generals were writing her letters under the table. She threw feasts that blurred the line between religion and PR stunt. One dinner allegedly cost enough to feed Egypt for a year. She drank pearls dissolved in vinegar to prove she could. History's first influencer flex. The message was clear. If wealth, wit, and seduction were weapons, she was armed to the teeth. Cleopatra didn't simply possess power, she looked like power. Every coin, every mural, every performance reinforced it. Her subjects didn't see a mortal queen playing politics. They saw the gods returning to earth. And that was her real genius. While Rome was busy conquering land, Cleopatra conquered imagination, and that lasts longer than marble. Cleopatra's life was going perfectly, which in history is the surest sign that disaster is warming up off stage. Julius Caesar, her Roman sponsor, lover, and human shield, had returned to Rome, where he was busy pretending to restore the Republic while secretly converting it into a personality cult. Cleopatra visited him there once, parading through the city with their son, Caesarion, a move so subtle that even Roman senators could smell the ambition from 3 streets away. Rome didn't like Cleopatra. She was foreign, intelligent, female, and worst of all, not remotely impressed by senators. Her presence in Caesar's villa whispered all the wrong questions. Was he planning to make himself king? Was she planning to make herself queen of Rome? And could someone please explain why Caesar's calendar reforms involved quite so many festivals in her honour? The whispers became daggers. On the Ides of March, 44 BCE, Caesar was stabbed to death in the Senate by the same men who dined with him the night before. Rome called it patriotism. Cleopatra called it a scheduling inconvenience. When the news reached Alexandria, she didn't mourn, not publicly. She locked herself in the palace, took inventory of her assets, and realized her entire political safety net had just bled out on a marble floor. Egypt was independent again, in the same way a small animal is independent when the lion drops dead. Then came the chaos. Rome split into factions faster than a modern comment section. Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, Mark Antony, his loyal general, and Lepidus, the guy history remembers only because he was standing nearby. Each wanted control of Rome, and each wanted Egypt's wealth. Cleopatra had two options: pick a winner or get annexed. She chose the same way she always did, by reading people better than they read themselves. Octavian was cold, young, and humorless. Lepidus was irrelevant. Mark Antony, on the other hand, was bold, impulsive, and famously bad with women who were smarter than him. In other words, perfect. Cleopatra would gamble everything again, just as she always had. Because in her world, loyalty was temporary, love was strategy, and survival, as always, depended on choosing the right Roman to ruin next. Mark Antony was everything Rome admired in a man: brave, charming, and catastrophically irresponsible. He drank like Bacchus, fought like Mars, and thought like, well, not at all. After Caesar's assassination, Antony had inherited half of Rome and all of its bad habits. When Cleopatra received his summons to meet him in Tarsus, she recognized opportunity wrapped in ego and cologne. Antony demanded her presence to explain her loyalty, which was Roman for show up and flatter me. Most rulers would have sent envoys. Cleopatra sent a floating theatre production. She sailed up the river on a golden barge, under purple sails that smelled of incense and scandal. Musicians played, slaves fanned perfumed air, and Cleopatra reclined under a gilded canopy dressed as Isis herself. It was less a diplomatic meeting and more a religious experience with better lighting. Antony, waiting on shore in full military armour, instantly forgot why he'd summoned her. Legend says she invited him to dinner, and he never quite left. The two of them together were unstoppable. And by unstoppable, we mean spectacularly self-destructive. Cleopatra had finally met someone who loved extravagance as much as she loved manipulation. Antony adored her wit, her laughter, and her treasury. She adored his influence, his loyalty, and his ability to annoy Octavian. Their relationship was an alliance first, romance second, and economic partnership always. Cleopatra funded his campaigns, fed his troops, and reminded him daily that Rome's east belonged to her, not him. In return, Antony gave her legitimacy, protection, and the world's most entertaining chaos. But while Egypt feasted and celebrated their union, Rome was losing patience. Senators back home whispered that Antony had fallen under a foreign spell. Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir and part-time professional buzzkill, began spreading rumours. Cleopatra had bewitched Antony, enslaved him, and was plotting to rule from Alexandria. For Rome, that was scandal. For Cleopatra, it was Tuesday. Still, she knew where this road led. Power always came with a curse, and Antony was charmingly doomed. But for now, she had what she needed: an army, a Roman general in her pocket, and enough perfume to mask the smell of future catastrophe. Cleopatra and Mark Antony didn't fall in love. They collided. He was Rome's greatest general. She was Egypt's last pharaoh. Together, they were what happens when two very charismatic people realize they can get away with anything as long as they look good doing it. Their relationship wasn't subtle. Cleopatra threw banquets that made Caesar's look like work lunches. Gold plates, silver couches, rivers of wine, entire ships turned into party venues. Historians say she once bet Antony she could spend 10 million sesterces on a single dinner, and won by dissolving a pearl in vinegar and drinking it. To Antony, that wasn't arrogance. It was foreplay. They called themselves the new Dionysus and Isis, merging godhood with public relations. She ruled Egypt as divine queen. He commanded Rome's eastern provinces as her consort. Their coins bore both faces, side by side, equally powerful. A partnership so blasphemous to Roman patriarchy it practically made Octavian break out in hives. But make no mistake, beneath the perfume and pageantry, this was politics. Cleopatra saw in Antony the one man who could protect Egypt from Roman greed. Antony saw in her the one woman who could bankroll his war with Octavian. Love was optional, survival wasn't. Still, it's hard not to picture the two of them in Alexandria, reclining on gold couches, drunk on both wine and their own myth. He, the soldier who thought with his sword, in every sense. She, the strategist who could turn a glance into an ultimatum. Between battles, they threw costume parties, founded drinking clubs, and reenacted divine rituals that blurred the line between religion and scandal. The city adored them, half because they ruled like gods, half because they acted like reality TV before it existed. But in Rome, Octavian was carefully rewriting the script. Antony wasn't a hero anymore. He was a fool. Cleopatra wasn't a queen. She was a temptress leading him to ruin. And like every great story of power and passion, they were too busy being legends to notice the trap closing around them. After all, history's greatest love stories usually end the same way, with bad press and excellent last words. If Cleopatra's love life had been a play, this was the part where the audience starts shouting, "Don't trust the Romans." But Cleopatra, ever the optimist, believed that the right combination of gold, charisma, and theatrical divinity could keep Antony's homeland from ruining everything. She was wrong. Back in Rome, Octavian, Caesar's icy adopted son, was building his image as the man who would restore Roman virtue, which, of course, meant slandering everyone who was having more fun than him. Antony was his easiest target. Drunk, impulsive, and now living in Egypt with a foreign queen who claimed to be a goddess. For Octavian's propaganda machine, it was like Christmas came early. He spread rumours faster than an ancient Twitter thread. Antony was bewitched. Cleopatra had enslaved him. They spent their days feasting while the East bled and the Roman Republic wept. It was, essentially, the first state-sponsored tabloid campaign. And it worked. The Roman public, who once adored Antony, now saw him as the man who traded his toga for eyeliner. Meanwhile, in Alexandria, Cleopatra was busy not caring. She had children to raise, fleets to build, and a kingdom to maintain. While Octavian fretted about Roman morals, she was launching a new dynasty, literally. Antony's twins with Cleopatra, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, were paraded before the people as living gods. They were the future, the divine heirs of East and West. Subtle. Not remotely. Effective? Absolutely not. Rome lost its collective mind. Octavian declared that Antony was planning to move the Roman capital to Alexandria, because nothing terrifies a Roman senator like someone else having a better view of the sea. He leaked Antony's will, or something claiming to be it, which conveniently left everything to Cleopatra and their children. The message was clear. Antony wasn't Roman anymore. He was hers. It was propaganda gold. And in the Game of Thrones that was Roman politics, Cleopatra had just been cast as the villain. But Cleopatra wasn't panicking. She'd seen worse. Brothers, betrayals, even carpets. She believed charm and logic could still win Antony his reputation and her kingdom's safety. Unfortunately, Rome didn't want charm. It wanted blood, and Octavian was already sharpening the knife. By 31 BCE, Cleopatra and Mark Antony were the ancient world's worst-kept scandal. Rome was no longer gossiping, it was sharpening spears. Octavian, Caesar's icy heir and professional hater of fun, finally declared war. Not on Antony, of course. That would be treason. No, he declared war on Cleopatra, because calling it a war against a woman made it sound noble instead of political. Cleopatra and Antony gathered their fleets in the Gulf of Actium, hundreds of ships, thousands of men, and roughly zero coordination. Antony commanded the army. Cleopatra commanded reality. Their plan was simple: win. The execution, less so. His generals advised patience. Cleopatra preferred spectacle. After all, what's the point of empire if it doesn't look expensive? As dawn broke on September 2nd, Antony's navy met Octavian's forces under Admiral Agrippa, a man with half the ego and twice the brain. The wind betrayed them, the sea turned against them, and the battle dissolved into an aquatic traffic jam of panic and smoke. Then came the moment history still argues about. Cleopatra, seeing the chaos, turned her flagship around and sailed straight through the fighting line, her purple sails flashing like a royal nope. Antony, in a heroic display of passion or very poor impulse control, abandoned command and followed her. Nothing says military genius quite like deserting mid-battle because your girlfriend left early. The remaining troops, confused and leaderless, surrendered. Octavian's navy mopped up the rest, and the future emperor quietly thanked whatever gods handle poor decision-making in rival generals. Meanwhile, Cleopatra and Antony retreated to Egypt in awkward silence. Their fleet was gone, their allies defected, and their reputation was sinking faster than the ships they'd just lost. Still, Cleopatra didn't cry. Queens don't. She recalculated. If the game had changed, she'd change faster. Antony, however, didn't have the same survival software. He brooded, drank, and occasionally practiced looking noble in defeat. Cleopatra began stockpiling treasure and sending envoys to Octavian, already setting the stage for her next pivot. The Battle of Actium wasn't just a loss. It was the receipt. Proof that passion makes terrible military strategy. And for Cleopatra, it was time to write her final act. This time, without anyone else sharing the stage. After Actium, Cleopatra and Mark Antony drifted back to Alexandria like two celebrities returning home after a very public breakdown. The city greeted them politely, the ancient equivalent of clapping while hiding the wine. Their navy was gone, their army was disbanding, and their relationship had entered the maybe we should see other empires phase. Antony, once Rome's golden general, now spent his days pacing palace halls and glaring at the horizon like it personally owed him an apology. Cleopatra, meanwhile, was already scheming. Unlike Antony, she hadn't forgotten the first rule of survival. If you're still breathing, you're still negotiating. She sent envoys to Octavian, offering treasure, alliances, even the crown itself. If he'd just let her keep Egypt. Octavian naturally ignored her. He had no interest in compromise. He wanted a parade. Specifically, one with Cleopatra in chains. Inside the palace, things got darker and quieter. Antony's loyal soldiers began defecting, sensing which way the wind was blowing. Cleopatra sealed off her treasury, counting gold and options with the calm precision of a woman planning her own ending. Every night she held audiences, dressed in full regalia, as if pretending the empire wasn't collapsing could somehow stop it. Then came the rumours that Cleopatra had betrayed Antony, that she was plotting to save herself. Octavian's envoys whispered lies, and Antony, ever the master of bad timing, believed them. In despair he fell on his sword, missing the part where Cleopatra was still alive. It was the ancient world's most tragic miscommunication, second only to the invention of politics. They carried him, bleeding and broken, to Cleopatra's mausoleum, where she held him as he died. The scene was pure theatre, gold walls, incense, and two doomed lovers performing their last act for history. He apologized for losing everything. She forgave him for being Roman. By the time Octavian marched into Alexandria, the dynasty was over. The priests fell silent, the nobles fled, and Egypt, once the jewel of the world, became just another trophy for Rome. But Cleopatra didn't flinch. She'd lost battles, lovers, and kingdoms. But she still had her image, and in a world run by men who worshipped control, that was her last weapon. When Octavian entered Alexandria, Cleopatra was done pretending to be mortal. Her armies had surrendered, her allies were gone, and her lover was dead. which, given her track record with men, was statistically inevitable. But Cleopatra didn't plan to die badly. If Rome was going to end her story, she'd direct the finale herself. She locked herself in her mausoleum, a glittering tomb she'd had built years earlier. Because when you're a Ptolemy, it's best to keep your grave pre-furnished. There, surrounded by gold, incense, and the world's most awkward servants, she began her masterpiece, a death that would outshine Octavian's entire career. Octavian, eager to show his victory, demanded that she surrender alive so he could parade her through Rome. The ultimate humiliation. Cleopatra agreed to meet him, but when he arrived, she emerged in royal robes and jewels, her head held high, as though she were doing him the favour. Even Octavian, the man who treated emotion like a taxable offence, was momentarily speechless. Still, he wanted her alive. A living Cleopatra was good propaganda. A dead one was just another headline. He left guards, confident she'd comply. Cleopatra smiled politely and began planning her exit. The details are legendary but delightfully vague. Some say she smuggled a venomous asp inside a basket of figs. Others say she drank poison disguised as perfume. Either way, when her servants finally returned, the queen was found seated on her throne, radiant and still, wearing her crown, as if death itself had paused to admire the staging. Octavian arrived too late. He'd won Egypt but lost the show. The woman he wanted to humiliate had written her own ending, elegant, symbolic, and impossible to improve upon. History would remember him as a conqueror. But Cleopatra? She became something rarer, a legend. Her death wasn't surrender. It was punctuation. The final deliberate period at the end of 3,000 years of pharaohs. The girl who'd survived a dynasty of lunatics, seduced an empire, and ruled through spectacle, had chosen the one act Rome couldn't control. In the end, she didn't die for love or pride. She died for authorship, because queens lose battles, but myths never kneel. Cleopatra may have died, but she refused to leave quietly. The moment she stopped breathing, Rome started rewriting. Octavian strutted around Alexandria declaring victory, though his army had mostly fought confusion and sand. He took her treasures, executed anyone too loyal, and claimed he'd liberated Egypt. From what exactly remains unclear, possibly from the burden of having culture. He paraded her image through Rome, but not her body. That was too risky. Even dead, Cleopatra had charisma. Romans feared the crowd might start cheering. So Octavian turned her into propaganda. A seductive witch, a foreign temptress who lured good men to ruin. Because, as everyone knows, when a powerful woman wins, it's witchcraft. When a man loses, it's her fault, yet the myth didn't die the way he hoped. For centuries, Cleopatra's name lingered like perfume after scandal. Poets, painters, and playwrights kept resurrecting her, each version more dramatic than the last. In some, she was a manipulator. In others, a martyr. But always, she was unforgettable. No one builds a legend that strong by being ordinary. Rome became the empire it had always wanted to be, bloated, efficient, joyless, while Egypt became a province, its gods repackaged as Roman tourist attractions. The pharaohs were gone, but Cleopatra remained, in marble, in manuscripts, in every whispered tale about beauty, power, and the fatal combination of the two. Even 2,000 years later, her name still carries voltage. Scholars argue over her ancestry. Lovers, politics, and death method like gossip columnists on a deadline. Hollywood turns her into a symbol of seduction. Historians try to turn her back into a ruler. The truth lies somewhere between a woman who used every weapon at her disposal, intellect, charm, timing, in a world where men controlled everything but her. She didn't lose. She was absorbed. Egypt fell, but Cleopatra ascended, into myth, where the victors can't touch her. Octavian became Augustus, Rome's first emperor. But ask anyone today who the last pharaoh was. They'll tell you. Ask who his name was, and most will blink. That's how history works. Conquerors get chapters, legends get eternity. Jerusalem smelled of incense and sweat. Beneath banners bearing the cross, knights prayed for salvation, and then paid for sin. Every crusader city, from Acre to Antioch, had what they called domus consolationis, houses of comfort. These weren't humble shelters for pilgrims. They were brothels, officially tolerated and sometimes quietly managed under church oversight. Because in the Holy Land, even the most pious needed release. After weeks of battle and blood, soldiers returning from raids lined the narrow streets of Acre. They sought wine, warmth, and women. The only relief that made life under God's burning sun bearable. These establishments were rarely hidden. Red lamps, perfumed air, and veiled women marked their doors. The church, which preached purity, learned early that trying to suppress lust only drove it underground. Instead, bishops and priests began regulating it, setting prices, approving moral conduct, and even collecting tithes from what they called necessary evil. Behind the altar and the confessional, priests knew the cycle well. A knight sinned on Saturday night and confessed on Sunday morning. The same man who kissed the relic of a saint would whisper filthy secrets through the confessional great hours later. This duality became a way of life. Sin was inevitable, and forgiveness, a service rendered for a fee. Absolution had become a business. Records from the orders of the temple and the hospital show how deeply this hypocrisy ran. Brothel taxes were sometimes used to fund repairs for chapels or hospitals. The same hands that held rosaries also counted the silver earned from sin. Confessors began to specialize in these sins of the flesh, guiding warriors through moral gymnastics to balance desire and devotion. The priests became spiritual accountants, subtracting lust, adding prayer. Yet, in this strange economy of guilt and grace, something darker brewed. Women in these houses were often captives, Greek, Syrian, or Armenian, taken as spoils of war. Their bodies became tools of both comfort and control. The church could forgive the men, but not the women. They remained the eternal sinners, even when their only sin was survival. And thus, in the shadow of the cross, redemption and corruption knelt side by side, both paying the same tithe to God's house. Forgiveness was supposed to be divine. But in the Crusader states, it was bureaucratic. Sin had a price tag, and the church made sure to collect. In cities like Jerusalem and Tyre, priests and monks worked alongside merchants to maintain what one chronicler called a holy balance between lust and redemption. Every transaction of the flesh was mirrored by another, the sale of spiritual pardon. A soldier who visited a brothel could buy back his soul before the next sunrise. All it took was a confession, a small donation, and sometimes a candle offering. Over time, this system became routine, a rhythm of indulgence and repentance. Priests even created sin tariffs, fixed rates for various transgressions. A night with a prostitute, 2 silver deniers, lying to a superior officer. 3. Killing a man without penance. 7. The spiritual marketplace was thriving. This trade in absolution filled the coffers of the Latin Patriarchate of Jerusalem. Money from these penances funded church repairs, new vestments, and even the maintenance of relics. To the clergy, it was better to channel sin than to fight it. If desire couldn't be destroyed, it could at least be taxed and purified through ritual. In a strange twist, the very sins the church condemned became the foundation of its financial survival in the East. For the crusading knights, this arrangement was convenient. They lived in constant fear of death and damnation. A battlefield confession could save a soul, but a quick visit to the priest after the brothel made eternity seem negotiable. Faith had become transactional, a system of spiritual bookkeeping, and in a land soaked in blood and temptation, everyone needed an accountant. The local clergy, many of them European men now stationed in the Levant, developed a kind of weary cynicism. They heard the same confessions over and over. "Father, I have sinned. Again." They absolved the same men countless times, knowing full well the cycle would repeat by week's end. Some began to joke that, for every soldier, 2 whores and 1 confessor are needed. It was an open secret. The cross on a knight's tunic might have symbolized purity, but behind the cathedral doors, purity was for sale. And as the war dragged on, the Church learned an eternal truth. Salvation, like everything else in the Holy Land, could be bought for the right price. While knights and priests debated morality, the women inside those brothels carried the true weight of the Crusades. They were the silent economy beneath the banners, forgotten in scripture, remembered only in whispers. Some were camp followers who crossed the Mediterranean seeking survival. Others were captives, Greek, Armenian, Syrian, or even Muslim women taken as prizes of conquest. Once they entered a domus consolationis, escape was rare. A woman's worth was measured in coin and confession. She was expected to provide comfort to Christian soldiers, but purity, that sacred obsession of the Church, was a one-sided ideal. For her, no priest offered absolution. In the eyes of the clergy, she embodied sin itself, a living temptation sent to test men's virtue. And yet, without her, the fragile illusion of Crusader piety would collapse. In Acre's red light quarter, the brothels formed a district of their own. By night, the air filled with lute songs, incense, and the smell of sweat and wine. Prostitutes wore crosses on their sleeves, not out of devotion, but as a mark of ownership. They were considered church property, protected and regulated like livestock. Bishops issued ordinances to ensure cleanliness of body before the soldiers entered, often forcing women to bathe in cold cisterns under guard. Even the act of sin had rules. Some women found cunning ways to reclaim fragments of power. They whispered gossip to priests, extracted favours from drunk knights, or earned secret fortunes that bought small freedoms. Others turned to faith in private, praying to saints who had suffered, Mary Magdalene chief among them. To these women, she wasn't just a saint, she was a mirror. A woman shamed by men, redeemed by her own endurance. Their stories were rarely recorded, but their presence shaped the moral landscape of the Crusader world. They softened the brutal edges of war with their humanity, even when treated as disposable. Behind every confession whispered in candlelight stood a woman who had made that sin possible. And though priests preached that these women were bound for damnation, the irony was unmissable. The men who damned them needed them most. In a land obsessed with holiness, salvation and desire slept under the same roof, separated only by a curtain, a prayer, and a handful of silver. If the brothels were the body of Crusader sin, confession was its soul, and the priests were the keepers of both. They lived in an impossible contradiction, guardians of morality who knew more filth than any soldier. The confessional became the war's true battleground, not of swords, but of secrets. Behind the carved wooden screens of chapels in Jerusalem or Antioch, knights unburdened their lusts, their murders, and their blasphemies. And the priests listened, not shocked, but calculating, to absolve or not to absolve. That was the priest's quiet dilemma. A knight who sinned too much might endanger his soul, but also his donations. The Church needed him alive, fighting and paying. Many confessors became pragmatists, turning divine law into moral arithmetic. Lust was a lesser sin than doubt, fornication, less dangerous than heresy. One priest reportedly told a soldier, "Better a warm bed than a cold faith." And with that, sin became manageable, even respectable. These confessions created a strange intimacy between warrior and priest. A knight might fear God, but not his confessor. They drank together, blessed each other before battle, and sometimes shared the same women. Chronicles mention priests caught frequenting the very houses they condemned, claiming they went only to save souls. In truth, temptation did not stop at the cloth. The papal authorities, far away in Rome, sent letters of warning, reminding their clergy to remain pure in body and spirit. But purity in the Levant was a myth. Desert winds carried too much dust, and even the holiest robes gathered stains. Many priests came to see their role as a kind of maintenance service, keeping men spiritually functional rather than saintly. When plague or battle claimed a knight, it was often his confessor who buried him, murmuring prayers over a man whose sins he knew too well. Some priests wept, not from pity, but from the exhaustion of hearing too much darkness. They were the psychologists of an age before therapy, balancing divine mercy with administrative efficiency. And so, the Church's most sacred rite, confession, became an open market of secrets, a system built not to purify men but to keep them marching. For every absolution granted, another sin was waiting, already rehearsed, already forgiven, already priced. Among the armoured knights and Latin priests were thousands of pilgrims, peasants, widows, merchants, all travelling to the Holy Land seeking redemption. Yet, the same ports that welcomed holy travellers also catered to their weaknesses. In Jaffa, Tyre and Acre, taverns doubled as brothels, and every pilgrim road had a house of comfort waiting just beyond the city gates. Pilgrimage, once a journey of purification, had become a test of temptation. These pilgrims often arrived weary, sunburnt and frightened. They had sold their possessions, endured storms and raids, and now stood where Christ once walked. But holiness was not what they found first. It was hustlers, traders, and women whose smiles promised comfort after years of hardship. The Church tolerated this paradox because pilgrimage brought profit. Each pilgrim paid taxes, bought relics, and donated at shrines. And when they inevitably sinned, they paid again, for confession, for penance, for redemption. Chroniclers wrote of priests who sat beside brothel doors, waiting to offer instant forgiveness. Some would bless travellers as they entered, and absolve them as they left. It was a closed loop of sin and salvation, a self-sustaining system that kept the wheels of faith turning. The Church called it pastoral care. The cynical called it business genius. Female pilgrims faced even harsher realities. Many were widows or wives accompanying crusaders, left vulnerable on the road. In some accounts, desperate women entered these brothels, not as clients but as workers, trading virtue for survival. A few found protection under knights or clerics, but most were simply absorbed into the machinery of sin and sanctity that defined the Crusader states. Yet the paradox went deeper than lust. Every pilgrim carried both devotion and desire in their hearts. The road to Jerusalem was meant to purify the soul, but it also stripped away illusions. Far from Europe's cathedrals, morality blurred. Survival became faith's truest form. By the time pilgrims returned home, they brought more than holy relics. They carried stories of indulgence, corruption, and the uneasy truth that holiness and humanity could not be separated. The Crusader world had transformed faith itself into commerce, and the pilgrim's journey into an endless confession, one that never really ended, even at the gates of Jerusalem. When the Crusaders first arrived in the East, they thought they were bringing civilization to a savage land. What they didn't expect was that the East would seduce them instead. The Levant was a world of perfumes, silks, and spices, a paradise that mocked their vows of poverty and restraint. Even the most devout knight found his resolve melting under the scent of jasmine and the softness of Damascus silk. Local culture treated sensuality differently. Byzantine and Arab cities had long operated under their own codes of pleasure, regulated, not hidden. In places like Antioch and Tyre, Crusaders encountered women who danced, bathed, and spoke openly of love. To men raised in grim stone castles and frozen chapels, this was intoxicating. The concept of holy war blurred with the experience of holy desire. And slowly, the Latin West began to adopt the East's unspoken rule. Sin, if properly managed, could coexist with sanctity. This cultural cross-contamination horrified the Church back home. Reports arrived in Rome describing knights who wore silk robes, burned incense, and kept concubines. One papal envoy lamented, "They came to fight for Christ and found comfort in the flesh of Saracens." But the truth was simpler. The Crusaders had discovered pleasure, and no amount of guilt could unlearn it. Some brothels even began offering women from distant lands, Moorish, Armenian, Greek, marketed as exotic salvation for the weary warrior. They spoke several languages, knew fragments of hymns, and learned to mimic piety when priests came knocking. A strange fusion emerged, women dressed in veils embroidered with crosses, offering both sin and solace in one gesture. For many nights, confession became part of the ritual, not an act of repentance, but of renewal. A night in silk, followed by a morning in sackcloth. Desire and devotion became twin pillars of their faith. The East had taught them something the West had tried to forget, that holiness without temptation was meaningless. By the 12th century, the line between the crusader and the courtesan had blurred beyond recognition. The Holy Land had become both a battlefield and a brothel, a place where men fought for heaven by day and bargained with hell by night, wrapped in silk and forgiven by dawn. By the height of the 12th century, confession in the Crusader states had evolved into something far beyond a spiritual duty. It was an economy in itself. Every sin had a price, every indulgence a receipt, and every act of repentance a potential profit. The Church had perfected a system where guilt could be monetized, and mercy could be sold in bulk. In the bustling streets of Acre, clerks sat behind wooden stalls near the great churches, recording payments made by soldiers, pilgrims, and even prostitutes. Confession receipts were issued as proof of absolution. Parchment notes sealed with wax and signed by a local priest. These slips became a kind of moral currency. If a knight was accused of vice, he could simply present his receipt, paid, forgiven, and sanctified. It was clever theology wrapped in economics. The Church maintained spiritual authority while ensuring financial stability. The same silver that bought indulgences, funded hospitals, fortified walls, and fed armies. As long as sin existed, and it always did, the flow of wealth never stopped. The papacy's representatives in Jerusalem even set quotas, expecting each diocese to generate a certain amount from penitential dues. Salvation had entered the marketplace. Knights joked about it openly. One chronicler records a knight saying, "God's forgiveness is cheaper than wine in Acre." But the laughter hid an uneasy truth. The crusading ideal was rotting from within. When virtue becomes transactional, faith becomes hollow. Priests began offering bulk absolutions before campaigns, blessing entire regiments at once to save time. Soldiers who died in battle were declared cleansed by default, their prior confessions assumed valid. Meanwhile, the brothels, unofficially taxed by the same church, provided a steady supply of customers. A knight could visit a prostitute, pay her in silver, then pay the priest in the same coin the next morning. The circle was perfect. Sin, spend, repent, repeat. This confession economy blurred the moral order of the Crusader world. It created a culture where men no longer feared sin, only unpaid dues. The Church had transformed human weakness into a renewable resource, a system that could outlast any war. In a strange way, the Crusader states had achieved what no theologian ever could. They had turned salvation itself into a business model. By the later Crusades, the tension between faith and vice had reached absurd levels. The Holy Land, meant to be the purest corner of Christendom, had become a moral mirage. On its surface gleamed cathedrals, relics, and holy processions. Beneath it, sin ran like a hidden river. Knights marched to Mass at dawn and stumbled from brothels by dusk. Priests who preached against temptation were rumoured to keep mistresses, and everyone, from the beggar to the bishop, seemed to know but refused to care. The contradictions were too profitable to challenge. Brothel taxes paid for the rebuilding of churches destroyed by Saracen raids. Confessional dues financed hospitals for wounded crusaders. Even relic traders, those peddlers of holiness, bought their imported spices and silks from the same merchants who supplied the houses of comfort. The entire Crusader economy was a web of sin feeding sanctity. Preachers tried to ignite moral reform. Bernard of Clairvaux himself thundered that the Crusaders had turned the Lord's vineyard into a tavern. But his warnings fell on deaf ears. The soldiers were tired, the priests complicit, and the Holy Land had grown used to its double life. In the taverns of Acre, drunk knights toasted with irony. To sin, may it never run out. Among the locals, this hypocrisy became a dark comedy. Muslim and Jewish merchants watched their conquerors prey in armour by day and barter for vice by night. Some even joined the trade, selling perfumes, silks and wines to the crusaders who claimed to despise excess. One chronicler from Damascus wrote, "Their cross is heavy, but their lust heavier still." Within monasteries, whispers spread that the frontier had corrupted even the holiest orders. Rumours claimed that Templars and Hospitallers kept secret brothels under the guise of charitable houses. Whether true or not, the stories stuck, because they fit too well, and yet the Crusaders still saw themselves as righteous. Confession kept their conscience clean, indulgences washed away guilt, and the next sunrise offered another chance to begin again, until the next sin. In that endless loop of repentance and relapse, the Crusaders created something uniquely medieval, a world where faith survived not in spite of sin, but because of it. The Holy Land, once a dream of purity, had become a theatre of contradictions, a divine joke whispered behind the confessional curtain. By the end of the Crusades, everything holy had a price. Swords, relics, indulgences, even redemption. The Church, stretched thin by endless wars and dwindling support from Europe, had institutionalized forgiveness. Penance was no longer a humble act of repentance, but a lucrative enterprise. Priests who once whispered prayers now issued documents, papal indulgences promising the erasure of sins for a modest fee. The lines between salvation and commerce had blurred beyond recognition. A knight who could not afford to return home might sell his armour for absolution. A prostitute might tithe part of her earnings to secure a mass said in her name. Even mercenaries began paying advance confessions, preemptive forgiveness for sins not yet committed. It was faith turned into accounting, redemption turned into paperwork. Every sin became a transaction, every prayer an invoice. The great irony was that this system worked. The Church remained solvent. The cities of the Crusader states glittered with marble, incense, and stained glass, monuments built from guilt. The faithful believed that by paying, they were participating in divine order, and the priests, half-believers themselves, saw no reason to stop what God clearly allowed to prosper. There were dissenters, of course. A few monks spoke against the trade, calling it a second Babel built on the bones of whores and warriors. But most were silenced or conveniently reassigned. The system had grown too big to fail, and in its twisted way it served its purpose, keeping faith alive, even when faith had become a shadow of itself. As the Crusades waned and the last Christian strongholds fell, the confession economy collapsed with them. But the idea survived. Centuries later, it would re-emerge in Europe as the indulgence trade, sparking revolutions, reforms, and wars of its own. The seeds of Martin Luther's rebellion were planted not in Wittenberg, but here, in the dusty confessionals of Acre and Jerusalem, where knights and priests turned sin into currency. In the end, the Crusader world left behind no pure saints, only men and women who learned to live between sin and sanctity. Their legacy was not holiness, but a lesson that wherever faith meets profit, salvation becomes just another commodity, stamped, sealed, and sold in the name of God. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, a name that drips with legend, poetry, and doubt. Ancient travellers spoke of it as if they'd seen heaven on earth, a palace wrapped in green, where trees grew from terraces instead of soil, and streams ran uphill through hidden channels. But here's the mystery. No one has ever found a single brick of it. Not one inscription, not one foundation stone, not even a tablet from Babylon mentioning its existence. Out of all the 7 wonders of the ancient world, this one might never have existed at all. According to the ancient Greeks, the gardens stood in the heart of Babylon, built by King Nebuchadnezzar II for his queen, Amytis of Media. She missed the mountains and forests of her homeland, so the king promised her a mountain of his own making, one made of stone, water, and love. Terraces were said to rise like steps toward the sky, each overflowing with palms, cypresses, and blossoms that perfumed the desert air. Water supposedly poured from hidden pumps that defied nature, irrigating every level in a perpetual man-made rain. Greek historians like Strabo and Diodorus Siculus wrote about it centuries after it supposedly stood. They described gardens so vast they could shelter full-grown trees, sustained by a marvel of engineering that baffled even modern minds, an ancient irrigation system that lifted the Euphrates itself. But these were second-hand stories, retold and romanticized by men who had never set foot in Babylon. They heard tales from soldiers, merchants, and dreamers, and wrote them down as fact. When modern archaeologists excavated Babylon, they found Nebuchadnezzar's palaces, his ziggurats, his inscriptions, his gates, but no garden. The silence of the earth raised an uncomfortable question. Had everyone been chasing a mirage? Some scholars began to suspect that the gardens weren't in Babylon at all, but far to the north, in the Assyrian capital of Nineveh, built by King Sennacherib. He, too, wrote of a palace without rival and gardens nourished by aqueducts. His city, unlike Babylon, had the water systems to make it real. So perhaps the hanging gardens never hung over Babylon's plains, but over Nineveh's hills. And like so many wonders of the ancient world, they live on not in stone, but in story, suspended forever between memory and myth. Every legend needs a heartbeat, and in this one, it belongs to a woman, Queen Amytis of Media. She was said to be the beloved wife of King Nebuchadnezzar II, ruler of the Neo-Babylonian Empire in the 6th century BC. History remembers him as the builder of Babylon's walls and its great Ishtar Gate, but love, it seems, inspired his most beautiful creation. According to Greek historians, Amytis longed for the green mountains and cool valleys of her homeland. Babylon, with its scorching plains and endless sands, felt lifeless to her. So Nebuchadnezzar vowed to bring the mountains to her. Imagine the king's vision. In the heart of the desert, he would raise a garden that climbed toward heaven. Terraces of stone would be stacked high, each planted with cypresses, palms, figs, and roses. Exotic trees from distant lands would hang over the walls, their roots hidden in deep earthen beds. Water would flow everywhere, glittering streams and misty cascades that turned the dry air cool. For Amytis, this would not just be a monument, but a piece of home reborn in the desert. It was an act of love disguised as architecture. Babylon's citizens called it the Mountain of Marvels. From afar, it looked like a green pyramid shimmering in the heat. From within, it was said to echo with birdsong and the hum of hidden machinery. Slaves and engineers worked tirelessly to maintain the illusion, hauling soil, pruning trees, and keeping the water flowing from sunrise to sunset. Nebuchadnezzar's devotion to Amytis became part of Babylon's identity. In an empire obsessed with grandeur and divine favour, the king's hanging mountain symbolized both royal power and tender affection. It said to the world, Babylon could conquer nature itself. But like every great love story, this one rests on fragile ground. No Babylonian inscription ever mentions Amytis. No records of the garden exist in the vast archives of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Was she real, or just a poetic invention by later storytellers? Perhaps she was a metaphor, not a woman of flesh and bone, but a symbol of Babylon's longing for beauty in a barren world. Whether queen or myth, Amytis became the soul of the garden, and the reason it still haunts history's imagination. Before we can imagine the hanging gardens, we must first picture Babylon itself, a city so grand that even its ruins left conquerors speechless. Set on the fertile plains of Mesopotamia, near the banks of the Euphrates River, Babylon was the beating heart of an empire that worshipped size, order, and spectacle. When ancient travellers approached its walls, they saw a city that glittered beneath the desert sun. Towers, ziggurats, and temples painted in deep blues and golds. Everything about Babylon declared its king's divine ambition. At the city's core stood the famed Ishtar Gate, a towering arch of glazed bricks, its surface alive with golden lions and dragons. It was both entrance and warning. Beyond this gate lay a city built to impress the gods. Nebuchadnezzar's palace stretched nearby, a labyrinth of courtyards, colonnades, and towering halls. Here, among marble floors and lapis walls, the hanging gardens supposedly bloomed. To the Babylonians, nature was not separate from the divine. Rivers were gods, mountains sacred, gardens symbolic of paradise itself. By creating a lush oasis in the middle of the desert, Nebuchadnezzar wasn't just indulging his wife, he was asserting control over the very forces of nature. A garden that hung in the air wasn't just a wonder of engineering, it was a declaration that Babylon had mastered creation itself. Visitors claimed the gardens were visible from miles away. They wrote of terraced layers that rose like steps to heaven, each one bursting with life. Palms, olives, cedars and vines. The sound of trickling water filled the air, while the scent of flowers mingled with incense from nearby temples. Birds from far-off lands were said to nest there, feeding on the fruits that cascaded down the walls. To stand beneath it was to stand inside a living temple, part architecture, part Eden. Yet beneath this paradise, Babylon's people lived ordinary, dusty lives. Traders haggled in the markets, priests tended their idols, and soldiers marched under the relentless sun. The hanging gardens, whether myth or reality, stood as a reminder of what Babylon wanted to be, a bridge between heaven and earth, where kings played gods and love could rewrite the laws of nature. If the hanging gardens truly existed, they would have been the most advanced feat of engineering in the ancient world. Babylon lay in the heart of a desert, where rain was rare and water meant survival. To sustain a mountain of greenery there, someone had to outwit nature itself. Ancient writers hinted at the miracle behind the beauty. A hidden system of gears, screws and pulleys that lifted water from the Euphrates River to the highest terraces, an artificial waterfall feeding an impossible paradise. Greek historians like Strabo and Philo of Byzantium described this mysterious mechanism as machines that drew water ceaselessly. Some believe it was an early version of what we now call the Archimedes screw, a spiralling tube that could lift water when turned by hand or animal power. Others think it used a chain pump system, with bronze buckets linked in an endless loop, clanking rhythmically in the shadows while life bloomed above. To the people of Babylon, this sound, the heartbeat of the gardens, would have been as sacred as temple bells. Imagine the scene. Beneath the terraces, slaves and engineers working in damp tunnels, shoveling water into channels carved through brick and bitumen. Above them, fountains spilled into pools, and the queen walked among palms and myrtles that swayed in the desert wind. Every drop of water that reached her feet had travelled uphill, a triumph of human will over nature's indifference. But such brilliance would not come cheap. The gardens would have demanded constant labour, a small army to tend, repair, and irrigate day and night. Babylon's engineers were already famous for their mastery of hydraulics. They had tamed rivers, built canals, and irrigated farmlands for miles. The hanging gardens were simply the grandest expression of that same obsession, the urge to control water, and through it, life itself. Whether myth or memory, this imagined machinery reveals something deeper about the ancient mind, a belief that paradise could be built, not just found. The gardens weren't merely decoration. They were proof that mankind could imitate the gods, turning barren earth into heaven through invention. And if the legend is true, the hum of those hidden machines was the sound of humanity's first great defiance against the limits of nature. In Babylon, nothing was ever built just for beauty. Every wall, every ziggurat, every column carried a message, and the hanging gardens, whether real or imagined, spoke louder than any temple. They were not simply a gift of love from a king to his queen. They were a proclamation of power. To build a mountain of greenery in the middle of the desert was to defy the natural world, and in ancient Mesopotamia, defiance of nature was divine territory. Only gods could create life in barren soil. Nebuchadnezzar was declaring that he too could do what gods did. The Babylonians believed kings ruled by divine favor, that their authority was an extension of the cosmic order. So when Nebuchadnezzar raised his mountain of marvels, he wasn't just building for a Midas. He was constructing a political statement. A king who could make the desert bloom could make an empire flourish. The garden was both a love letter and a propaganda piece, a visual sermon about his unmatched wealth, engineering, and piety. Visitors entering Babylon through the Ishtar Gate would have seen the terraces shimmering above the city walls, greenery spilling over like water. To foreign envoys, it was breathtaking. To Babylon's subjects, it was a reminder their king could command both earth and sky. The hanging gardens symbolized the triumph of civilization over chaos, an eternal theme in Mesopotamian thought. The wild had been tamed. The gods were pleased. The king reigned supreme. Even the choice of plants carried meaning. Imported cedars from Lebanon, myrtles from Media, and lotus from distant lands turned the garden into a living map of Nebuchadnezzar's empire. Each flower was a quiet reminder of conquest. The air itself became imperial, perfumed by victory. And while poets praised its beauty, priests understood its deeper role. The hanging gardens were a ritual space, a place where divine order was displayed through human design. It was not enough for Babylon to worship the gods. It had to rival them. In that way, the gardens transcended romance. They became the perfect symbol of Babylon itself, seductive, impossible, and proud. A city that refused to bow to the laws of nature, just as its ruler refused to bow to the limits of man. For centuries, travellers swore that the Hanging Gardens stood in Babylon. Greek historians like Herodotus, Strabo, and Diodorus Siculus described them with awe, terraces of lush greenery rising like a staircase to heaven. Yet the curious thing is this. The earliest Babylonian records, thousands of clay tablets detailing every aspect of the empire, never once mention the gardens. No construction orders, no workers' lists, no royal dedications. Nothing. It was as if the most magnificent creation of Nebuchadnezzar's reign had been erased from history before it was ever written. This silence baffled archaeologists. When the German scholar Robert Koldewey excavated Babylon in the early 1900s, he searched tirelessly for traces of the fabled wonder. He found massive walls, a royal palace, and even vaulted rooms that he believed might have supported the gardens. But there was no irrigation system, no sign of the waterworks the ancient writers described. Later scholars re-examined his findings and concluded he might have mistaken something else entirely, perhaps a storehouse or a ceremonial court, for the legendary site. Then came a twist. In the 1990s, Oxford scholar Stephanie Dalley proposed a daring theory. The Hanging Gardens weren't in Babylon at all. They belonged to Nineveh, 300 miles to the north, the capital of Assyria, ruled by King Sennacherib. Unlike Nebuchadnezzar, Sennacherib actually left inscriptions describing a wonder for all people, a garden watered by an intricate network of aqueducts and canals. His texts even mention the world's first known water-raising screw, centuries before Archimedes. Dalley's argument upended history. Maybe Greek writers, hearing stories of an eastern wonder of greenery, confused the two great cities. Babylon's name survived, while Nineveh's was destroyed and forgotten, buried under centuries of conquest. The legend, like a seed blown by the wind, had simply taken root in the wrong soil. If true, it changes everything. The Hanging Gardens weren't a Babylonian love story at all, but an Assyrian triumph of engineering, a political masterpiece disguised as paradise. Yet perhaps that's the point. The story was never about geography. It was about the human need to believe that somewhere, once upon a time, a city in the desert made the impossible bloom. Whether in Babylon or Nineveh, the legend endures, because truth in the ancient world always grows best in shadow. If the Hanging Gardens didn't rise over Babylon, then perhaps they bloomed in Nineveh, the Assyrian capital that once rivaled any city on earth. In the 7th century BC, King Sennacherib ruled from its walls, calling himself King of the World. His ambitions dwarfed even those of Nebuchadnezzar. He boasted of transforming Nineveh into a palace without rival, fed by a water system so vast and sophisticated that it stunned engineers 2.5 millennia later. If paradise had ever been built by human hands, this was where it stood. Sennacherib's inscriptions describe an irrigation network spanning mountains and valleys, 50 miles of canals, tunnels, and aqueducts. He even mentions an invention that sounds suspiciously modern, a water-raising screw, centuries before Archimedes was born. These machines lifted water from the Tigris River into a series of terraced gardens surrounding his palace. His own words tell of trees of all lands, brought from distant corners of the empire, date palms, cypresses, pomegranates, and figs, planted to create a green sanctuary for the delight of the eyes. Archaeological evidence supports his claims. Outside modern-day Mosul, the remains of massive stone aqueducts still stand, bearing inscriptions of Sennacherib's reign. The most famous of them, at Jerwan, features cuneiform texts celebrating his miracle of water. Nearby, carved reliefs from his palace show gardens with terraces, streams, and royal figures beneath shade trees, a visual echo of the Hanging Gardens myth. So how did Nineveh's wonder become Babylon's? The answer lies in history's cruel erasures. After Sennacherib's assassination, Assyria fell. Nineveh was burned, its libraries buried, its name nearly wiped from memory. But Babylon endured in legend and scripture, the city of pride, excess, and divine punishment. When Greek historians heard tales of a wondrous garden in Mesopotamia, Babylon was the only name they recognized. The story simply migrated south. If Daly's theory is right, the Hanging Gardens were real, just misplaced by time. They weren't built for love, but for glory. Sennacherib's terraces were a monument to control. Water conquered, nature disciplined, empire eternal. And yet the irony is poetic. The true garden may have perished, while the false one, the myth of Babylon's paradise, continues to live forever in the world's imagination. The Hanging Gardens live in a strange twilight, too detailed to be pure fiction, yet too elusive to be proven true. Over centuries, the line between history and imagination blurred until the gardens became something more powerful than either, a shared memory of paradise. Ancient writers described them so vividly that readers could almost smell the myrrh, feel the cool mist, and hear the murmur of hidden fountains. Whether they existed or not, no longer mattered. The story itself became the wonder. This merging of myth and memory reveals much about the ancient world. To the Greeks, who adored order and beauty, the Hanging Gardens were a symbol of human triumph over nature. To later scholars, they embodied love, a king's devotion turned into architecture. And to modern archaeologists, they represent the eternal human desire to shape the impossible. Each culture, across time, saw in the gardens a reflection of itself. Even today, Babylon's ruins whisper fragments of that legend. Broken bricks bear Nebuchadnezzar's name, but no trace of the paradise he supposedly built. Travellers still visit, hoping to glimpse some evidence that the poets weren't lying. Yet what they find instead is silence, a silence that invites imagination. Perhaps that's why the story endures. Every era, from ancient scribes to satellite archaeologists, has tried to fill that silence with new theories, new dreams. In a way, the myth survived precisely because it was unprovable. The absence of evidence became the fuel for endless reinvention. Artists painted it as a floating mountain of vines and waterfalls. Poets called it the stairway between heaven and earth. When Alexander the Great conquered Babylon, his men swore they saw the remnants of the gardens, though perhaps what they really saw were their own fantasies reflected in the ruins. Over time, the Hanging Gardens came to stand for more than Nebuchadnezzar or Sennacherib ever intended. They became a symbol of longing itself, for beauty, for order, for something eternal, amid the dust of history, a city that vanished, a queen who may not have lived, and machinery that defied gravity, all woven together into a story that refuses to die. Because sometimes the greatest wonders of the world are not built from stone, but from memory. Though the Hanging Gardens may never have existed in brick or bloom, they became immortal in art, language, and longing. Painters of the Renaissance imagined them as terraces of marble and gold, dripping with vines and waterfalls, rising toward an endless blue sky. Poets called them the Bride of Babylon, Eden remade by human hands. Every generation rebuilt them in its own imagination, each more extravagant than the last. A wonder that may never have been, yet one that has never stopped being rebuilt. Even the phrase hanging garden became eternal shorthand for the unreachable, the dream of a paradise that man might construct if only he could master nature. Architects, emperors and conquerors borrowed the idea for centuries. From Persian pleasure gardens to Mughal palaces, echoes of Babylon's myth bloomed across continents. When modern engineers designed the terraced skyscrapers of Singapore or Dubai, they were, in spirit, rebuilding the same legend. A structure where water, stone and greenery defy gravity in perfect harmony. The persistence of the myth says something profound about humanity itself. We want to believe that once, long ago, a king built heaven for love. That amidst conquest and cruelty, someone looked at the barren desert and thought, "Let there be beauty." Whether it was Nebuchadnezzar or Sennacherib or neither, that impulse, to turn desolation into life, is the thread that ties us to them across millennia. Modern archaeologists still dig and debate, but perhaps the truth no longer matters. The Hanging Gardens belong as much to myth as to memory, and that may be their greatest victory. Myths survive what monuments cannot. Babylon's walls have crumbled, its ziggurats are dust. But the story of a green mountain rising in the desert has outlasted every empire that once ruled those sands. When travellers speak of the seven wonders, they still pause at this one. It is the only wonder that exists nowhere and everywhere, a masterpiece suspended between the real and the imagined. The Hanging Gardens remind us that wonder itself is an act of faith. You don't need to see paradise to believe in it, you only need to imagine it. And so the legend lives on, forever blooming in the gardens of the mind. Rome, the heart of the ancient world, built on discipline, conquest, and command. At least, that's what history books like to say. But beneath the marble statues and imperial virtues, there pulsed another Rome, one ruled not by law, but by lust. This was an empire where pleasure wasn't sin, but spectacle. Every craving, from the innocent to the obscene, could be found somewhere within its walls. By day, senators debated morality and virtue in the forum. By night, many of those same men slipped into shadowed courtyards and candlelit chambers where silk curtains hid their shame. Rome's obsession with pleasure was as organized as its military. It had rules, rituals, and even a philosophy. The Romans didn't see indulgence as weakness. They saw it as proof of civilization. To enjoy life to excess was to show that you had conquered necessity, that you were more than mortal. The city itself seemed built to tempt. Public baths, thermae, were the social centres of Roman life. There, naked bodies glistened under marble arches, steam curling through the air like incense. Senators discussed politics while slaves offered oils, massages, and gossip. Women and men mingled freely, blurring the line between hygiene and hedonism. In these baths, business deals and love affairs were sealed with equal seriousness. Even the art reflected this obsession. Frescoes on villa walls showed gods and mortals locked in eternal embrace. The god Bacchus, patron of wine and pleasure, became a household symbol. His festivals, once religious, turned into week-long celebrations of intoxication, theatre, and erotic dance. But for every toast to Bacchus, there was a sermon from a philosopher warning of Rome's decay. Men like Seneca and Juvenal railed against luxury and lust, while rumours swirled that they, too, had tasted the forbidden. Hypocrisy was a Roman virtue all its own. The empire's power gave it the means to indulge every desire. Spices from India, perfumes from Egypt, silks from China. Every pleasure on earth flowed into Rome. And with it came the creeping realization that empire and excess were inseparable. To rule the world was to own its temptations. And in Rome, pleasure was not rebellion against power. It was power, dressed in gold, perfumed, and waiting behind closed doors. Behind the stately columns and political speeches, Rome's elite indulged in spectacles far more secret than any gladiatorial game. These were the convivia nocturna, the forbidden feasts of night, where senators, generals, and high-born matrons gathered not for debate, but for decadence. In marble villas overlooking the Tiber, musicians played softly while slaves poured wine until the floor itself shimmered. The air smelled of myrrh, sweat, and spilled honey. Here, the rules of the Republic dissolved. Masks were worn, not for anonymity, but for permission. Under flickering lamplight, status meant nothing. A patrician could lie with a slave, a senator's wife could share a lover with a poet, and no one would speak of it by dawn. It was said that invitations to these gatherings were more coveted than a consulship. To be excluded was social death. To be seen leaving at sunrise was a badge of dangerous privilege. The emperors themselves elevated excess into art. Nero hosted banquets that lasted for days, where guests reclined on rose-petal cushions and drank wine sweetened with saffron. Entire ceilings were rigged to rain flowers and perfume upon the crowd. Servants served peacock tongues, flamingo livers, and oysters said to stir the blood. Yet, as the guests grew dizzy with wine and desire, musicians changed tune, and the feast transformed. Candles dimmed, garments slipped, and Rome's most powerful people became slaves to the oldest empire of all, the body. But these weren't mindless indulgences. Orgies were often political stages in disguise. Alliances were forged in whispers between embraces. Secrets traded in pleasure carried more weight than Senate decrees. An emperor could humiliate rivals simply by controlling the invitation list. In a world where reputation was everything, these gatherings made and broke the careers of men who claimed to be moral guardians of the state. And yet, by morning, those same men would stand in the forum, wrapped in their togas, preaching restraint and order. That was the Roman way. Sin lavishly, then moralize publicly. Pleasure was not the opposite of virtue in Rome, it was its mirror. For the powerful, the body became another battlefield, one where conquest was measured not in lands or legions, but in the surrender of others. To the Romans, pleasure was not always rebellion. Sometimes it was devotion. Religion and sensuality often shared the same altar. The gods of love, fertility, and wine demanded rituals that blurred the line between prayer and ecstasy. The Lupercalia, for instance, began as a fertility rite honouring Faunus, the rustic god of wild nature. Priests called Luperci would run through the streets naked, striking women with strips of goatskin to bless them with fertility. The crowd laughed, cheered, and sometimes joined in. It was chaos disguised as sanctity, or sanctity disguised as chaos. Then came the cult of Bacchus, the most infamous of all. What began as harmless wine festivals spiraled into wild midnight ceremonies filled with music, masks, and frenzy. Men and women drank until their voices blurred into chants. Torches flared, drums beat faster, and soon the faithful fell into rapture. Outsiders whispered that orgies followed, that the bacchantes, driven mad by the god, embraced strangers in the dark as acts of divine surrender. The Senate, terrified of this loss of control, eventually banned the Bacchic rites altogether. But the worship continued, in secret groves, in torchlit caves, in whispered prayers behind closed doors. Even the temples of Venus, the goddess of love, held their own contradictions. In certain shrines, priestesses known as meretrices sacrae offered themselves not as sinners, but as servants of the divine. To sleep with one of them was to share in the goddess's blessing. To refuse was almost impious. Religion gave lust a moral mask, and the people wore it gladly. This merging of the sacred and the sensual made Rome unique. The body was not condemned. It was celebrated as a vessel of divine experience. The same hands that poured wine for the gods might later pour it over a lover's skin. To be human was to be carnal, and to be carnal was, in its way, holy. The moralists of the empire, Stoics, philosophers, and senators, called this madness. They saw decay where others saw devotion. But for the average Roman, piety and pleasure were not opposites. They were two halves of the same prayer. One whispered to heaven, the other moaned in the dark. If there was one place where Rome's obsession with the body became undeniable, it was the Thermae, the public baths. To the Romans, bathing was more than hygiene. It was ritual, recreation, and performance all at once. Every class of citizen, from senators to slaves, gathered beneath vast domes filled with steam and laughter. Water gurgled through marble fountains. Light streamed through high arches. And in that shimmering air, modesty melted away. A typical Roman bath complex was a city within a city, complete with libraries, gardens, gyms, and lounges. Patrons moved through stages of pleasure: apoditerium, the changing hall; tepidarium, the warm room; caldarium, the hot bath; and finally the frigidarium, the cold plunge. But these weren't just cleansing rituals. They were theatre. Every gesture, every word, was part of an unspoken choreography of flirtation. Senators discussed politics while watching athletes oil their bodies. Noblewomen, veiled but curious, met lovers behind the misted columns. Even emperors visited, though they brought their own retinues to ensure the gossip stayed contained. The baths were also a marketplace of desire. Courtesans wandered freely, offering smiles and services with practiced subtlety. Musicians played near the fountains. Perfume sellers misted the air with rose and myrrh. Slaves rubbed scented oils onto their masters' backs, sometimes lingering longer than necessary. In these marble temples of steam, class, and virtue dissolved in the heat. The citizen and the courtesan, the philosopher and the gladiator, all were equal before the mirror of the water. Conservative Romans, of course, were horrified. The historian Sallust called the baths the ruin of Roman discipline, claiming that they softened both body and spirit. But by the empire's height, this protest had become little more than performance. The same senators who decried decadence in the forum were often spotted reclining in the caldarium, surrounded by dancers and drink. By evening, the baths transformed into dens of intrigue. Lovers arranged secret meetings, spies traded whispers, and poets scribbled verses about the reflections of naked gods in rippling pools. For the Romans, water cleansed more than skin. It washed away inhibition. The Thermae became their mirror, pure on the surface, turbulent beneath. A place where pleasure was never hidden, only perfumed, shared, and baptized in heat. If the baths were Rome's playground, the brothels were its confessionals, the places where the empire's desires were both exposed and absolved. They were everywhere, in the bustling Subura district, near the gladiator schools, even tucked behind temples. From the outside, a lupanar looked ordinary: a narrow doorway, a flickering lamp, the faint smell of wine and oil. But step inside, and you entered Rome's most honest institution. The walls of these houses of pleasure were covered in frescoes depicting every act imaginable. Not as art, but as advertisement. Each room was small, sometimes barely large enough for a bed and a niche for a coin box. Payment was made up front, usually a single as the price of a loaf of bread. Prostitutes, called lupi or she-wolves, worked day and night under the watch of the leno or lena, their pimps. Some were slaves, others freedwomen, and a rare few entrepreneurs of their own lust. The clientele ranged from filthy labourers to noblemen in disguise. Romans saw no shame in visiting a brothel, only in being caught preferring passion over politics. For many, these encounters were transactional acts. nothing more. But for others, the lupanar was escape, a place where social rank dissolved, where a senator could kneel before a slave and forget the world outside. Pompeii's brothel remains frozen in time, its graffiti offering glimpses of the human stories within. "I'm yours for 2 asses," one inscription reads. Another boasts, "Restituta pleases the best." It was crude, honest, and deeply Roman. Sex, to them, was a trade like any other, regulated, taxed, and sometimes even blessed by the gods. Venus herself had shrines near many lupanaria, as if sanctifying what others might call sin. The empire's appetite extended beyond Rome's borders. In port cities like Ostia and Alexandria, brothels catered to sailors, soldiers, and merchants of every nation. Exotic courtesans, Nubian, Greek, Gallic, were prized for their novelty. Pleasure had become an empire-wide export, one as valuable as olive oil or wine. And yet, in this world of bought love, loneliness lingered. Beneath the painted smiles and perfumed hair, the lupe lived short, hard lives, worshipped at night, forgotten by dawn. Rome's hunger was endless, but its heart rarely lingered where it feasted. In a city obsessed with pleasure, desire became a science, and the Romans treated seduction like a discipline. Apothecaries, perfumers, and witches thrived in the back alleys of Rome, selling everything from scented oils to dangerous love potions. Behind the respectable facades of herbal shops, women known as veneficae whispered promises of passion for a price. "Make him burn for you," they said, mixing wine with strange powders, crushed herbs, and the occasional drop of blood. Love, in Rome, could be bottled. Perfume was the first weapon of attraction. Roman men drenched themselves in imported Arabian myrrh and Egyptian kyphi, while women favoured floral oils of rose, jasmine, and saffron. The scent wasn't just for allure, it was status. To smell of the East was to advertise wealth and sophistication. The poet Ovid, in his Ars Amatoria, even gave step-by-step guides on how to use perfume, clothes, and glances to conquer a lover's heart, or at least their attention. But the darker side of desire was alchemy. Love potions were brewed to enslave hearts, dull rivals, or inflame lust beyond reason. Recipes varied: mandrake root for madness, cantharides for arousal, or poppy resin to loosen inhibitions. The results were unpredictable and often fatal. Tales spread of men who went mad, women who vanished, and lovers who turned violent after drinking too deeply from the wrong cup. Yet demand never faded. In a city where everyone competed for affection and influence, love was both currency and weapon. Even the upper classes dabbled in such sorcery. The Empress Messalina was rumoured to use potions to maintain her legendary appetites, while senators' wives sought charms to reclaim wandering husbands. A common spell involved tying hair from the beloved into a knot and burning it with incense while chanting Venus's name, a plea for passion disguised as prayer. Rome's poets mocked it all, but they understood its pull. "Love is war," Ovid wrote, "and every soldier needs his weapons." The Romans believed that pleasure could be engineered, that nature itself could be seduced. Yet for all their potions and perfumes, one truth remained. Nothing enslaved the heart quite like obsession itself. Rome could conquer the world, but it could never conquer desire. If the brothels were Rome's underworld, the courtesans were its queens. They moved through the city like living art, educated, perfumed, and dangerous. Unlike the lupi who worked in dim rooms for coins, these women, known as meretrices honestae or honourable courtesans, entertained philosophers, senators, and generals. They were paid not only for pleasure, but for presence, conversation, poetry, intellect, and intrigue. To dine with one was a privilege. To be loved by one could ruin or remake a man's reputation. The most famous among them became celebrities of the empire. Volumnia Cytheris, once a slave, became mistress to Mark Antony and companion to Rome's greatest poets. Others, like Faustina and Flora, were known not just for beauty, but for political sway. They attended banquets beside men of rank, spoke freely about politics, and sometimes whispered secrets they were never meant to hear. In an empire ruled by men, these women learned to wield power in the only way society allowed, through fascination. Their salons rivaled temples in opulence. Musicians played soft lyres, while perfumed lamps flickered against walls painted with scenes of Venus and Mars. Guests reclined on cushions, discussing love and philosophy as the courtesan poured wine and guided conversation like a skilled general commanding an army of words. Seduction, for them, was theatre. Every gesture rehearsed, every silence deliberate. Many were highly educated, trained in Greek literature and rhetoric. They quoted Homer, debated Stoicism, and recited poetry that could charm even the most hardened soldier. Some kept writers and artists as lovers, shaping Roman art and literature from behind the curtain. Poets like Propertius and Tibullus immortalized them, women whose beauty inspired sonnets, whose cruelty inspired despair. But Rome's double standards were merciless. These same women who dazzled emperors could never marry them. They existed in the gilded shadows, worshipped, envied, and condemned. When the Senate debated morality, courtesans were often the scapegoats of decline. Yet behind closed doors, those same senators sent them gifts, letters, and poems written in trembling ink. The courtesan embodied Rome's greatest contradiction. She was both pleasure and power, sin and sophistication. In a world where virtue was worn like a mask, she was the only one honest enough to admit she was performing. For every indulgence Rome celebrated, there was a price. Beneath the perfume and poetry, decadence corroded the empire from within. Pleasure had become addiction, and addiction demanded escalation. What began as luxury turned into dependence, on feasts, on lust, on the endless pursuit of stimulation. Even the moralists who condemned excess were trapped by it. They could not look away from the very vice they denounced. Feasts grew obscene. Emperor Vitellius was said to dine 4 times a day, consuming flamingo tongues, eels fattened in milk, and peacocks stuffed with spices from India. Nero, never one to be outdone, hosted banquets where the guests reclined on silver couches under ceilings, rigged to rain rose petals, sometimes so many that people suffocated beneath the flowers. Pleasure had lost its grace. It had become spectacle, a competition of appetites where moderation was mocked as weakness. The pursuit of desire also bred paranoia. Love potions turned to poisons, seduction to blackmail. Courtesans were accused of witchcraft, senators of perversion. The Empress Messalina, infamous for her insatiable nature, was executed not for adultery, but for ambition. Her pleasures made her too powerful. Pleasure was no longer private. It was political, and in Rome, that was a death sentence. Even the philosophers began to despair. Seneca warned that luxury leads to ruin, while Juvenal mocked Rome as a city addicted to its own corruption. But their words were whispers against the roar of feasts, games, and laughter. The people didn't want virtue, they wanted escape. In the crowded taverns and perfumed baths, they found it, and yet, beneath the surface, unease spread. The soldiers on the frontier saw their pay delayed while the rich drowned in wine. Farmers abandoned the fields to chase wealth in the cities. The empire's body was still strong, but its soul was rotting. Rome could command 1,000 legions, but not its own desires. In the end, the empire's greatest conquest was itself. Pleasure, once a symbol of freedom and civilization, became its poison, slow, sweet, and irresistible. The Romans had believed that indulgence was proof of greatness, but they learned, too late, that nothing consumes an empire faster than the luxury it worships. As the empire staggered toward its decline, Rome's pleasures grew louder, as if the city could drown out its own death throes with laughter, wine, and flesh. The old virtues of restraint and duty had crumbled. In their place rose a desperate hunger for sensation. What the empire could no longer conquer with legions, it tried to conquer with indulgence. And so, as barbarians pressed on the borders, the Eternal City partied harder than ever. The feasts became grotesque parodies of their former glory. Senators arrived in peacock feather robes, dripping gold, while musicians played through the night. Courtesans poured wine from silver amphorae, and slaves fanned guests with ostrich plumes. The dishes themselves were absurd. Dormice rolled in honey, flamingo brains, camel heels, and pearls dissolved in vinegar for divine cocktails. Nothing was sacred anymore. Everything was edible, desirable, or disposable. Yet beneath the silk and song, there was fear. The city's heart had grown hollow. The baths echoed with rumours of invasions. The temples, once filled with worship, now echoed with hollow laughter. Philosophers muttered that the gods had abandoned Rome, that the city's lust had driven away its soul. Even the brothels, once symbols of life and vitality, became haunted places of decay. The women who once wore gold now begged in the streets. The gods of pleasure had devoured their own priests. When Alaric's Visigoths finally entered Rome in 410 AD, they found a city that had already collapsed in spirit. The fires they set were only the final act in a long, slow burning. The marble villas stood silent, their frescoes of Venus cracked and fading. The empire that had once ruled the world lay drunk on its own ruin, rich in art, poor in meaning. And yet, the legend of Rome's forbidden pleasures lived on. Later generations would whisper of its feasts, its orgies, its intoxicating mix of sin and splendour. The city that fell for lust became immortal through it. For all its corruption, Rome had dared to celebrate the body, to worship the senses, to turn pleasure into philosophy. And though the empire died, that impulse, to taste, to touch, to feel beyond restraint, never did. Rome may have fallen, but desire, as always, survived.